Dungeons and Dragons, Pathfinder, Star Wars, Star Trek, Warhammer 40k, the Discworld. You pick the setting, but regardless of your pick, we always have the same idea when it comes to prisons, with slight variations. An idea, of course, heavily influenced by our modern times and concepts. But what about ancient times? Is it important for you to know how societies handled those who broke or were believed to have broken the law before prisons were a thing? Honestly, I believe it helps tremendously if you do, so I invite you to stick around, have a cup of something tasty and hold on to your dear socks, as I will give you a short and sweet version of what you need to know to take your world building to the next level. Hello all you wonderfully funky people, Funky Monkey here. Welcome to today's episode of Funky Monkey MP. Today's episode will be a little more gruesome towards the end, as we will be discussing capital punishments in ancient Rome, so just be advised. With that, let's start digging through history, shall we? To better help us understand prisons, I think it's best that we start with what having such places in your world brings to the table. First and foremost, the classic prison escape starts of a campaign or a short adventure. Nice, sweet, straightforward. But more than that, it will allow you to create plot hooks and plot twists to rope your players in and make your world feel even more believable. So ask yourself this: are there high security prisons in your world? Where are powerful magic users who break the law incarcerated? Where are the commoners who steal from merchants taken and held? Where are the usurpers, the deposed leaders held, if anywhere? Who is guarding all of these prisons? As you can see, all of these questions are very useful as they help you create more intrigue and more believability. By the way, we will be treating Dungeons and Oubliettes separately, because they are very different, but I feel the need of mentioning this right now, as both Dungeons and Oubliettes ended up meaning prisons in more recent times, and then they changed their meaning once again. But right now, we are only focusing on the earliest forms of imprisonment, so Dungeons and Oubliettes are another story for another time. Oh, and one more thing. The difference between prison and jail is very simple. Prison is where individuals carry out their sentence, while jails are facilities where individuals are held for a very short period of time before trial, release, or even execution, depending on the time and period. With that established, what is a prison? According to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, a prison is a place of confinement, especially for lawbreakers. Pretty straightforward, and you already have a clear picture of what a prison looks like and how it functions. But what is the origin of prisons? In ancient Roman times, people were held only for a very short period of time, as imprisonment was not really a sentence. No one was expected to be locked up for a long period of time, but there were facilities that allowed for individuals to be incarcerated for a short time while awaiting trial or execution. One such facility was the Tullianum, or the Mamertine prison. This was a building that had a prison, or carcer, used to hold criminals guilty of heinous crimes, and also a dungeon or an oubliette. Carcer is a name that has since been adopted in many fantasy settings to define a layer in hell where the souls of savage criminals would be sent for punishment. The Mamertine prison was built in the 7th century BCE, around 640 or 616, it's really unclear. And it was originally a water cistern that was repurposed. Being initially a cistern meant it wasn't really meant for human habitation, and as such, the prisoners were lowered in the chamber they were to be held in through a small opening in the ceiling. The Tullianum was in essence a jail and not a prison, as individuals were held there for a very short duration, although the conditions were awful, perfect for holding criminals. If not prisons, then what? Imprisonment or incarceration was not mentioned in the Roman law, although they did have something akin to imprisonment. That was detention. This was mentioned in the 12 tablets, a legislation that was set in stone and displayed in the Roman Forum for all to see and guide their lives around. These were the 12 laws that were the foundation of the Roman state and were passed in 449 BCE. But in the case of the detention mentioned by the 12 tablets, it actually meant several different things, among which debt bondage or nexum. This meant that the collateral for a loan was the person themselves, but it is unclear what the conditions were and how someone was absolved of their debt. Was it by working until the debt was paid off, or working in lieu of interest? Unclear. These contracts were voluntary, but there were some contracts that were involuntary. Another detention was wearing of chains in public, also known as vincula publica, especially for slaves. While the last form of detention was mainly encountered in the imperial era, and detention meant, in this case, hard labor in mills, mines, quarries, and even large agricultural estates, also known as latifundia, something akin to plantations. These places all had a combination of free laborers who were there of their free will and were paid, enslaved individuals, and convicts. People detained in such places were held in semi-underground pens called ergastula. Another very popular form of punishment was exile. This was reserved for more influential people, or those who were guilty of some political crimes, or those who cheated the state in some way. For many, this was a very severe punishment, as Rome was considered the center of the world and living there was a privilege even if you were an ordinary citizen. Imagine what it was like for those in the upper class with a modicum of power being exiled from Rome, but this applied to other settlements as well. Being thrown out, exiled from a place of civilization was a very severe blow that many didn't take that well. Now, if you want to learn more things that will allow you to make your worlds feel more alive with just a sprinkle of effort on your behalf, make sure you hit that like button, let the algorithm know you want more videos like this, and make sure you also subscribe and join this funky community. And just take inspiration from history. That's why I'm here, to help you with that, so why not also hit the bell button so you get to see my lovely face when my next video is out. It's a win-win situation. Now, let's get back to our world building. What about high-profile prisoners? This brings into discussion a very interesting and strange practice from ancient times that you could easily implement in your world. This practice was of hostage exchange between nations. There was a clear distinction between prisoners of war and hostages through treaties. High-ranking prisoners of war were usually paraded during triumphal ceremonies before the citizens of Rome, and then held in miserable conditions, at least for a while, without any regard of their previous status, be that of a king, a nobleman, or a high-ranking officer. For example, the last king of Macedonia, Perseus of Macedon, was captured by Romans after being defeated in the Battle of Pydna in 168 BCE. Ancient sources blame him for not ending his own life, given that he was a defeated king, and the treatment enemy royalty received from Rome was well known. Perseus used to have a treaty with Rome, and his younger brother, Demetrius, was actually sent as a hostage in Rome. After being paraded before the citizens of Rome, he was held for 2 years in horrid conditions. Now, the sources are split. Some speak of him being tortured and eventually killed in 166 BCE, while others speak of him receiving eventually clemency and living out the rest of his life in good conditions. His son, Alexander, was kept in custody by the Romans, as he was only a kid when Perseus was defeated. he learned Latin, he became a skilled metalworker, and eventually became a public notary, living the rest of his life as a Roman. On the other hand, as you might glean from this story, the hostages had a wildly different life from prisoners. They were housed on the properties and estates of high-ranking Roman officials or noble families. They would enjoy an education, guests, activities worthy of their rank and status, and of course would also start building relationships with their hosts, in some instance leading to them gaining enough support from the Romans to ascend to power in their native lands with the help of Romans, and they would end up as loyal allies of Rome. Although Rome had a propensity of parading her enemies in cages during triumphs, only a few of them were actually executed, especially those who were either very large thorns in her side or betrayed her. Yes, Rome had a very big problem with nations that were once allies and then turned their backs against her. Among those who were executed, we find Gaius Pontius, the Samnite general who, after defeating the Romans in the Caudine Forks, decided against advice and good sense to strip the Roman soldiers, the officers, and even the consul to the skin and have them pass under a yoke as they were allowed to retreat from the canyon they were ambushed in. This did not sit well with Rome. Vercingetorix, who revolted against the Roman rule, Adiatorix, who executed the whole population of a Roman colony, although he was a supporter of Mark Antony, were among a few others who were executed. With that being said, the most high-profile captives ended up being paraded, held in poor conditions for a while, and then either executed or given new lives in the Roman Empire or Republic, as opposed to combatants or civilians taken into slavery, and wildly different from hostages who received a lot of perks and liberties. What did prisons look like? According to sources and descriptions from ancient Rome, they were very poorly ventilated, poorly lit, underground, filthy, cramped, made to exhaust prisoners physically and demolish them mentally. Although this seems barbaric, only those who committed heinous crimes would be held in prisons. The prisons would be usually divided in two areas: the inner area, more secure, and an outer area for individuals who did not need so much security. The families and friends of the detainees were expected to provide food and clothes, so the state did not spend too much, if anything, on rations. Later, with the consolidation of Christianity, Christian priests would offer charity to detainees, although this was highly regulated. The presence of these priests in prisons kinda also made sure that the guardsmen were less brutal with the detainees. Who guarded the Roman prisons? The role was given officially around 290 BCE to the Capitales, a group of militiamen tasked with guarding prisoners, under the direct supervision of a state official, namely the urban praetor. The urban praetor was the senior officer of Rome in the absence of consuls. This individual would organize the defense of the city if needed, would oversee the vigiles, the watchmen of the city who were also firefighters and the police force, and would not be allowed to leave the city for more than 10 days in a row in case something went wrong in Rome. Forms of punishment and execution in ancient Rome. This is the more gruesome part, so please be advised. The first part is okay-ish, the last part is kinda not graphic but not as pleasant. Depending on the crimes committed, people would receive different punishments, as you might expect. Theft, usually a fine several times the value of the goods stolen was enough. Couldn't pay the fine, public whipping or slavery until the debt was paid off. Here we have the involuntary contracts. Couldn't repay the debt, slavery or working it off, again involuntary contracts. A peculiar punishment was making detainees wear wooden soles with no flexibility, making it very hard for them to run away, and it was also a form of public shaming. But what happened to those who broke the law in such ways that they were considered to have committed atrocities? Depending on the crime, they were subjected to different capital punishments. For example, a parricide, meaning the murdering of a close relative. For those found guilty of such a crime, the punishment was poena culei, meaning penalty of the sack. So poena coeli. This was the only death penalty that a civilian could actually receive according to Roman law. It meant that the individual found guilty would be placed in a sack with live animals, including a dog, a monkey, a snake, and a chicken or a rooster. They would all be sewn in and thrown into running water. As the sack went down, the animals would panic and try to escape, of course, maiming the other animals and the criminal. This, to be honest, is a very weird way of executing someone, especially since they would be killing innocent animals. Of course, most of the times, monkeys were not available. Chickens and roosters were kinda expensive, snakes would not always be found, and people would not want to give up their dogs, so I'm pretty sure they found workarounds. Actually, most likely, according to modern translations of the different sources, the guilty individual would simply be sewn inside a leather sack and thrown into running water, leaving the animals out of it. Alternatively, during the time of Emperor Hadrian, those guilty of parricide would be thrown to the animals in the arena. During the Byzantine period, on the other hand, instead of the poena culei, or the arena, these murderers would be burnt alive. Another method of execution was the rupes Tarpeia, or the Tarpeian rock. This was a cliff on the Capitoline hill used in the case of traitors, perjurers, murderers, and thieving slaves. The cliff was 25 meters or around 80 feet high, and those found guilty were flung off of it. If somehow they survived the fall, there would be individuals armed with clubs waiting to deliver the final blow. This form of execution was also used because it bore the mark of shame. It was done publicly. Another method of execution was strangulation within the Tullianum, and this was the usual capital punishment employed by the Romans. We also have some more specialized or more specific breakings of the law that were punished in a very specific way. For example, if the holy fire of the temple of Vesta, the Roman goddess of the hearth, went out because of the negligence of a priestess, that priestess would be beaten in the dark, in a dark chamber or in the dead of night, and through a curtain to preserve her modesty. Then the flame would be relit. If a Vestal virgin, a priestess, on the other hand, broke her oath of chastity, she would be put to death. But Roman law said that no blood could be spilled in Rome, so she would simply be walled in an underground chamber within the boundaries of the city, or simply buried alive. If the goddess Vestala herself did not intervene to save the Vestal priestess, it was further proof of her guilt. If her lover was identified and found, he would be publicly beaten to death by the Pontifex Maximus, the highest priest in Rome. And as a last entry on this gruesome list, crucifixion was reserved for slaves, especially those who revolted. This form of punishment was not exclusive to Romans, as many ancient people used this form of punishment, and it came in a multitude of variations. From being placed upside down, from being placed in water, impaled instead of nailed, etc., etc., and by the gods, etc. It is amazingly shocking what creative forms of bringing pain to other humans we as a species come up with. These are in essence the main methods of punishment in ancient Rome, at least for civilians, as the military had other methods of punishment, but that's another story for another time, because the military punishments and rewards deserve videos of their own. Now, how do we use what we learned in our world building? We could go about this by simply taking everything we learned today and just inserting it in the world. Have a maximum security prison for magic wielders where an ally is held, and come up with a prison break before they are executed. Come up with an officer that can be bought to help you infiltrate, and have a whole specially created elite force that keeps the prisoners subdued. Another one is having a society that does not believe in incarcerating people even for the shortest of time. And there are only two instant methods of punishment: death or exile. Things are very cut and dry, and the population is deeply affected by this, but they cannot rise up. See, the only limit is your imagination. And with that, I believe we have reached the end of this video. Potato's first name, because I'm doing this again, because my wife was right, I didn't do it properly the first time, is Crispy Sweet Potato Dust. Thank you so much for the privilege of your time. I truly hope you found some inspiration and learned something new today, and I can't wait to see you all funky people here next time on Funky Monkey MP, the place where you get your dose of history, world building, and even trivia. Remember, be curious, take inspiration from the past, and never stop learning, world building, and creating amazing things, whatever those are. Your mind and imagination are awesome, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Until next time, have yourselves a wonderful, wonderful, funky day. Cheers.